So I'm in the youth work section of a theological library, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to share with you some of the most influential youth work books of the last 3 or 4 decades. Now, caveat, these aren't necessarily the best books or even the most popular books, but they are the books that arguably had the biggest impact on youth work training here in Britain, and the books that tend to be cited the most and are still widely for sale today. So I'm going to begin with an absolute classic, one of my all-time favourites, Phil Moon and the late Mark Aston, Christian Youth Work. This came out in 1986, the year that I came out. I'm also 35 years old. And what this did is it really inspired a whole generation of youth work thinkers and writers to publish and produce resources and books and training to talk about how we do youth ministry. And one of the unique aspects of this book is it has 2 solid pillars. One pillar is good biblical theology, and the other is a reflective view of youth culture. So this interwove the culture of young people with the theology of the Bible. Brilliant. Now, a few years later, in 1990, Duffy Robbins wrote this, which is Youth Ministry Nuts and Bolts. And this was one of these first hyper-functional youth work manuals. How do you actually do it? So this includes chapters like how do you build a ministry team? How do you work with families? How do you make decisions without making enemies? Brilliantly practical. Not long after that came Peter Brierley's Reaching and Keeping Teenagers. Now, this came out in 1993 and was a really in-depth look at the world and the life and the psychology of a teenager as it fits into our practice. Really helpful. Staying with Britain, we get to Youth Work and the Mission of God, still a standard text in most youth work training centres. This is Pete Ward, and this is really a significant book in what I call the second wave of incarnational youth work. This came out, I think, in 97, and it was really about how do you build incarnational youth work? How do you do detached work and focus really on the individual young person in their specific youth work culture? Purpose-driven youth ministry. Whereas people like Pete Ward were focused on incarnational youth ministry, Doug Fields was focused much more on funnel method of youth ministry. How do you attract a huge number of young people through attractional models and draw them down into smaller groups later? So this came out, I think, a year after Pete Ward wrote, so 98, and is hugely systematised and strategised and wonderful 90s fonts. Now, not long after that, we had a whole bunch of edited youth work handbooks written by a huge variety of well-known Christian charity leaders and youth workers at the time. It's really hard to pick which one was the most influential of those, but I'm going to go for this. This is Josh McDowell's Youth Ministry Handbook, and the reason this is so important is he gathered not only a whole bunch of quite famous faces, but he covered an enormous breadth of youth ministry topics and philosophy and theologies, and dialogued them all in one book. Now, this is 2000, and in some ways it was a response to another book. This one here, Reaching a Generation for Christ. This came out 3 years earlier, and it's by Richard Dunn and Mark Center, and this had a little bit more of a conservative lean, a little bit more of a emphasis on history and tradition and theology, a little bit less on practice, but where it did talk about practice really distinctly was mission and evangelism with young people. Influential, but perhaps not as influential as Josh McDowell's. And then, not to be outdone, and the last of the manuals, 1 year after Josh McDowell's Youth Ministry Handbook came out, this Youth Ministry That Transforms. And this is by Stroman, Jones and Ron, and what they were really trying to do was focus in on the personality and the longevity and the health of the youth worker, not just the ministry that they did. Very, very useful. Another couple of books of note, Tim Hawkins, 2003, 2004. He really focused hard on the strategy aspects of youth work. How do you bring young people in, build them up and send them out? And he paralleled that with the health of the youth worker. And I think this was largely responsible for books like Your First 2 Years in Youth Ministry by Doug Fields. Mark Yaconelli's Contemplative Youth Ministry. This came out, I think, in 2006, and is really one of those first books that dealt with contemplative spiritual formation practices in young people, particularly Ignatian spirituality. Very interesting. And this really spawned a lot of the contemplative responses to youth work. Very influential in books like The God-Bearing Life or some of Andrew Root's work. Now you may have noticed I've not mentioned Chap Clark, Len Calgar, I've not mentioned Mike Yaconelli. All of these were brilliant, influential authors, but I think the books I've picked out here give you a snapshot of how youth work has developed over the last 30, 40 years. In terms of the last 10 years, it's a little bit more difficult because youth ministry handbooks, especially over here in the UK, have become less popular. But maybe something like Theological Turn in Youth Ministry by Andrew Root is quite an influential book today. Maybe this isn't it, but the same author, Mark DeVries' Sustainable Youth Ministry. And I'd hope, a bit cocky, but I'd hope even my own book, Rebooted, which is now standard text in a lot of UK and US youth ministry training colleges. So it's not a complete picture, and they're not necessarily the best youth work books, but that does give you a bunch of stepping stones for the last 3 or 4 decades, so really the entire history of modern models of youth ministry, and gives you some marker points for how our practice has developed. If you were to read those books in order, you would see little movements between them that takes us to the form of youth ministry that we have today. Hopefully that's useful, and I'll see you next time.